You're sitting in a doctor's office. You're filling out a form. It asks about your family background. You check a box. Ashkenazi Jewish. Your doctor nods and says it matters. It changes what tests they'll recommend. You've probably done something like this before. Maybe you didn't think twice about it. Maybe you just checked the box and moved on with your day. But what if that single checkbox is connected to one of the strangest population stories in human history? What if the people who came before you passed through something so extreme it left a mark still visible in your DNA today? Not a story you were told at a family dinner. Not a story in a history textbook. A story written directly into your cells. Here's a number to hold on to. Researchers who study Ashkenazi Jewish genetics believe the population may have gone through a bottleneck, a sudden dramatic shrinking, down to just a few hundred people, sometime in the last 1,000 years or so, a few hundred people. And today there are roughly 10 million Ashkenazi Jews around the world. Let that sink in. 10 million people, tracing back in some way to a group small enough to fit inside a single village. Most people think Jewish ancestry is simple. One group, one homeland, one story, moving in a straight line from ancient times to today. That's what most people believe, if they think about it at all. But the real story is messier than that. It's also more interesting. And it involves more countries, more disasters, and more turning points than most people ever hear about. Let's start at the beginning, or at least as close to the beginning as historians can get. The name Ashkenazi comes from a medieval Hebrew word used to describe Germany. For centuries, Jewish communities lived along the Rhine River in cities that are now part of Germany and France. Historians often point to this region as the home base where Ashkenazi Jewish identity, as we know it today, really started to take shape. Small communities, close neighborhoods, shared language, shared customs, shared survival. But your ancestors didn't stay there. Nobody moves for no reason. And the people who would become the Ashkenazi Jewish population of today moved again and again across centuries for reasons that ranged from opportunity to outright danger. Here's where it gets stranger. Around the 900s and continuing over the centuries that followed, many Ashkenazi communities began moving east, into Poland, into Lithuania, and eventually into parts of the Russian Empire. This wasn't one single migration. It was a slow drift happening over generations, community by community. Some moved to escape violence. Some moved because rulers in Eastern Europe, at certain points in history, offered Jewish communities more stable conditions to live and work under. Some moved simply because that's where opportunity seemed to be. Small steps, big consequences over time. Think about what that actually means for a family. A grandmother in one generation grows up speaking one language in one town. Her grandchildren grow up speaking a different dialect in a completely different country, hundreds of miles away. This kind of shift happened over and over for hundreds of years, across thousands of families, every migration, every marriage, every new town, adjusting to new neighbors, new rulers, new dangers. That's the pattern hiding behind a single checkbox on a modern medical form. But scientists found something else, something genetic researchers didn't fully expect when they first started digging into it. When they studied the DNA of Ashkenazi Jews from all over the world, people whose families ended up in the United States, in Israel, in Argentina, in South Africa, and dozens of other countries, they found something remarkable. No matter where these families eventually settled, their DNA showed they all came from roughly the same small starting group. A group so small, some researchers have estimated it may have dropped to somewhere around a few hundred people at its lowest point, before expanding again. That means a family in Brooklyn and a family in Buenos Aires, who have never met, who speak different languages, who grew up eating different foods and celebrating in different countries, can still share long stretches of matching DNA. Not because they're distantly related the way any two humans are distantly related, because they both descend from an unusually small founding population, and that population's genetic fingerprint got passed down, copied and recopied, into millions of descendants. Here's the science part, explained simply. Your body carries something called autosomal DNA. That's the DNA you get roughly half from each of your parents, and it carries most of your family history. When researchers compare autosomal DNA across many Ashkenazi Jewish people today, they find long matching segments of DNA shared between people who have never met and don't know they're related. That kind of pattern is a signature scientists look for. It's called a founder effect. It shows up when a small group of people expands into a much larger population over time, while still passing down the same genetic fingerprints to nearly everyone who comes after them. Studies looking at this pattern, including genetic research published over the past 2 decades, suggest the Ashkenazi population may have expanded from a very small number, possibly just a few hundred to a few thousand people, into the millions we see today. The evidence suggests this expansion happened relatively quickly in genetic terms, likely within the last several hundred years. Scientists are still refining exactly how fast and exactly how small the lowest point really was. But the overall shape of the story, a dramatic shrink followed by rapid growth, shows up again and again in different studies using different methods. Here's where it gets stranger still. This isn't just an interesting historical detail. It has consequences that show up in doctors' offices today, all around the world. Because the founding population was so small, certain genetic mutations that happened to be present in a few of those founders got passed down to a much larger share of their descendants than you'd expect in a bigger, more mixed population. Normally, a rare mutation stays rare, spread thin across millions of unrelated people. But when your starting population is only a few hundred people, a mutation carried by just a handful of them can end up much more common a few hundred years later, simply because so many of today's descendants trace back to that same small group. This is the uncomfortable part of the story, and it's important not to skip past it. Researchers have identified a number of inherited conditions that appear more often in people with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry than in the general population. Tay-Sachs disease is one of the most well-known, a serious inherited condition affecting the nervous system, caused by a mutation that, while rare worldwide, is found more often among people with Ashkenazi ancestry. Gaucher disease is another example researchers have studied closely, and certain mutations in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes linked to a higher risk of breast and ovarian cancer, also appear more frequently in Ashkenazi Jewish populations than in many other groups. This is exactly why doctors ask about Ashkenazi ancestry on medical intake forms. It isn't a random question, and it isn't about singling anyone out. It's a direct, traceable result of that ancient genetic bottleneck, still shaping health outcomes for real families today, generation after generation. Genetic counselors take this seriously, and many people with Ashkenazi ancestry choose to get tested for these specific mutations, so they can make informed decisions about their own health and their children's health. This is where a lot of people feel uncomfortable, and honestly, that discomfort makes sense. A small starting population isn't just a fun trivia fact. It has real, lasting consequences for real families. It means some people carry a higher chance of passing down a serious illness through no choice or fault of their own, simply because of where their ancestors happen to be standing, genetically speaking, hundreds of years ago. That's a heavy thing to sit with. But understanding it is also what allows doctors and families to prepare, to test, and in many cases, to prevent serious harm before it happens. None of this means any group is somehow weaker or more flawed or less whole than any other group. It's important to be clear about that. Every population on Earth carries its own set of inherited risks, shaped by its own unique history of bottlenecks, migrations, and mixing. Some of those risks are well studied. Many others simply haven't been researched as closely yet. The Ashkenazi story isn't unusual because Ashkenazi Jews are somehow different from everyone else. It's unusual because, due to a combination of history and modern research funding, this particular population has been studied in unusually close detail. The patterns researchers found here are a window into something universal, how population history quietly shapes health, not evidence of anything unique or lesser about the people carrying it. Now here's where the story gets even more tangled and, honestly, more interesting. For a long time, some researchers and historians debated where Ashkenazi ancestry actually traces back to before that community settled in Europe. One theory that gained a lot of public attention over the years pointed toward the Khazars, a powerful Central Asian empire that, according to some historical accounts, had rulers who converted to Judaism sometime around the 8th century. This theory suggested a large part of Ashkenazi ancestry might trace back to Central Asian rather than Middle Eastern roots. This idea spread widely, showing up in books, documentaries, and countless online debates. It felt like a compelling twist, but when scientists actually went looking for genetic evidence to support it, comparing Ashkenazi DNA to populations from the historical region associated with the Khazar Empire, the genetic evidence did not support a major Khazar origin for the Ashkenazi population. Instead, most genetic studies point toward a different, more layered picture. A mixed ancestry, with roots connecting back to populations in the Middle East, blending over the centuries with populations in southern Europe, especially Italy, before the community that became known as Ashkenazi Jewish fully took shape in the Rhineland and later spread east. Read that again. The DNA doesn't point to one single simple homeland, sitting untouched for thousands of years. It points to a layered mix, Middle Eastern roots, European mixing, especially with Southern European populations, centuries of migration and intermarriage, all of it folded together into the population we now call Ashkenazi. This matters, because it says something bigger about how ancestry actually works, for basically everyone, everywhere. Ancestry isn't a single thread, running in a straight, unbroken line from one ancient group to you. It's more like a rope, made of many smaller threads, twisted together over centuries. Some threads come from one region, Some come from another. Some threads are thick and easy to trace. Others are thin, faint, and hard to fully untangle, even with modern DNA testing. The Ashkenazi story is a particularly well-documented example of this pattern. But the pattern itself, mixing, migration, blending, shows up in almost every population scientists have studied closely. So who, really, were the people who survived that bottleneck all those centuries ago? We don't know most of their names. We don't know most of their individual stories. History rarely keeps detailed records of ordinary people. The farmers, the merchants, the parents just trying to get their children safely to adulthood. But we know, in broad strokes, what they lived through. Displacement, disease outbreaks that swept through medieval Europe, killing enormous numbers of people regardless of background. Periods of violence and persecution that forced communities to move again and again, seeking safer ground. Economic hardship. And through all of it, somehow, enough of them survived and had children, and those children had children, until a population that may have dropped to just a few hundred people eventually grew into the millions of Ashkenazi Jews alive today. You carry a piece of that story, whether you've ever thought about it or not, if you happen to share that ancestry. And if you don't share that specific ancestry, you still carry a version of the same basic pattern, because every single person alive today is the descendant of ancestors who survived something, a famine, a war, a disease outbreak, a journey across an ocean or a mountain range or a border, under conditions that were anything but easy. Zoom out for a second and think about what that really means. Every person alive today is carrying a genetic record of their ancestors' survival written quietly into their own DNA, whether they realize it or not. Yours is no different. It just happens, in the Ashkenazi case, to be a record that scientists have been able to read with unusual clarity because the bottleneck left such a clear, strong genetic signature behind. Somewhere in your own DNA, whoever you are, wherever your family comes from, there's a similar story waiting to be read. Most people simply don't have researchers combing through their specific ancestry with this level of detail, the way Ashkenazi genetics has been studied over the past few decades. That's worth sitting with for a moment. Your family survived things you'll probably never know the details of. Your body is, quite literally, proof that they made it through. Every scar in the historical record, every plague, every war, every forced migration, passed through real people, people who kept going anyway, people whose only legacy, in many cases, is the fact that you exist at all. This isn't a closed case, and it probably never will be. Researchers are still debating the exact timing of the Ashkenazi bottleneck. They're still debating exactly how small the founding population really was at its lowest point. They're still working out exactly how the Middle Eastern and Southern European genetic threads first came together and in what order and under what conditions. Every few years, a new study using better DNA sequencing technology adds another piece to the puzzle. And sometimes those new pieces contradict older theories entirely, forcing researchers to rethink assumptions that had stood for years. That's actually how good science is supposed to work. It's not a straight line toward one final, permanent answer. It's a slow, sometimes messy process of testing ideas, finding new evidence, and being willing to change your mind when the evidence points somewhere new. The Khazar theory is a good example. It was a popular, widely discussed idea for years, but when better genetic evidence came in, researchers were willing to say, clearly, that the evidence didn't support it, and to point toward a more complicated but more accurate picture instead. Think about what this means beyond just this one population. Every group of people alive today has a story like this hiding in their DNA, whether or not anyone has fully mapped it out yet. Every group has bottlenecks in their past. Every group has mixing events, migrations, and moments where their entire future hung on a surprisingly small number of survivors. The Ashkenazi story isn't special because it happened. It's special because, thanks to modern genetic research, we can actually see it happening, laid out in the data in a way that's usually invisible to us. And this raises a bigger question, one worth thinking about even after this video ends. What does it actually mean to belong to a group? Is it the DNA passed down silently through generations, whether anyone talks about it or not? Is it the culture, the language, the traditions, and the shared history that gets passed down through stories, not just genes? Or is it some combination of both, tangled together in ways scientists are still trying to fully understand? There's no single, simple answer. But the Ashkenazi story shows just how much biology and history can intertwine, shaping not just how a group understands itself, but how doctors treat patients, how researchers design studies, and how families make decisions about their own health generation after generation. Here's something else worth considering. This kind of research doesn't just tell us about the past, it actively shapes the present. Because scientists identified specific mutations linked to Ashkenazi ancestry, doctors today can offer targeted genetic screening to patients who might benefit most from it. Couples planning to have children can choose to get tested for Tay-Sachs and other inherited conditions before starting a family, giving them information their own grandparents never had access to. People with a family history of breast or ovarian cancer can get tested for the specific BRCA mutations more common in Ashkenazi populations, allowing for earlier screening, earlier detection, and in many cases, better outcomes. In other words, understanding this population's genetic bottleneck hasn't just been an academic exercise. It has changed real medical decisions for real families in ways that can genuinely save lives. That's a powerful example of why this kind of research matters, beyond simple curiosity about where a group of people came from. But scientists found something else, something that adds yet another layer to this story. Beyond the disease-related mutations, researchers studying Ashkenazi genetics have also looked at other traits that seem to show up more often in this population than in others. Patterns researchers are still working to fully understand, and in some cases, still debate the significance of. This is an area where researchers are careful to avoid overstating conclusions, since genetics and traits like intelligence or personality involve enormously complex interactions between many genes and countless environmental factors, and drawing firm conclusions from population-level patterns alone is something serious scientists approach with real caution. None of this means one group is better, smarter, healthier, or more important than any other group in any meaningful sense. That's not what this research shows, and it's not what serious researchers claim it shows. What it actually shows is something more interesting than a simple ranking. How a small, specific historical bottleneck happening at a specific place and time can leave fingerprints across an entire population's genetics for centuries afterward, shaping everything from disease risk to the patterns researchers can trace back through history. Every population has its own version of this story. The Ashkenazi case is simply one of the more thoroughly studied examples we currently have. Let's come back to the migration story for a moment, because there's more to it than the move from the Rhineland into Eastern Europe. Over the following centuries, especially from the late 1800s through the mid-1900s, huge numbers of Ashkenazi Jewish families left Eastern Europe entirely. Some moved to escape violent persecution and organized attacks on Jewish communities. Others moved seeking better economic opportunities, as industrialization reshaped where jobs and stability could be found. And, in the darkest chapter of this history, millions of Ashkenazi Jews were murdered during the Holocaust, a genocide that devastated communities across Europe and permanently reshaped the size, location, and structure of the entire Ashkenazi Jewish population worldwide. This is a moment in the story that deserves to be named directly, not softened or rushed past. The Holocaust wasn't just a historical tragedy in a general sense. For Ashkenazi Jewish genetics specifically, it represents an additional devastating population bottleneck, layered on top of the older, more distant one researchers study through DNA. Entire family lines were erased. Entire communities that had existed for centuries in specific towns across Eastern Europe simply ceased to exist. The population that survived and later rebuilt communities in Israel, the United States, and countries around the world carried forward not just genetic history, but the direct living memory of unimaginable loss. This is the uncomfortable complication at the heart of this whole story, and it's important to sit with it honestly. Genetics can tell us about ancient bottlenecks, migrations, and founder populations stretching back centuries, but it can also, in more recent history, reflect the direct genetic impact of deliberate, targeted violence against a specific group of people. Both of these things are part of the same broader Ashkenazi genetic story. Both deserve to be understood clearly, without minimizing either one. Zoom out again and think about what this means for identity, for inheritance, and for what gets passed down between generations. Every family carries forward more than DNA. They carry forward memory, tradition, language, and, in cases like this, the direct legacy of surviving something horrific. Genetics can show us the population-level patterns. It can show us the bottlenecks, the founder effects, the disease risks, but it can't fully capture what it actually felt like to be one of the people living through these events. The fear, the loss, the impossible decisions, the sheer will it took to keep a family, a community, and eventually an entire population moving forward. You are, in some sense, the product of every decision your ancestors made to keep going, no matter what stood in their way. That's true whether your ancestors survived a medieval plague, a forced migration across a continent, or a genocide in living memory. It's true whether you know the details of your own family's specific history, or whether, like so many people, those details were lost somewhere along the way, never written down, never passed along clearly enough to survive to your generation. This is part of why ancestry research, and DNA research more broadly, has become so popular in recent years. People are searching for pieces of a story that often wasn't fully passed down to them. A DNA test can't tell you your ancestors' names, or their personalities, or the specific choices they made. But it can offer a kind of proof, a signal written into your own cells that connects you to a much bigger, much older story than most of us usually think about in our day-to-day lives. Here's where it gets stranger, one more time before we come to the end of this particular thread. Researchers studying Ashkenazi DNA have also looked closely at how this population compares, genetically, to Sephardic Jewish communities, Jewish populations, whose ancestry traces more directly through Spain, Portugal, and North Africa, following a very different historical migration path. While Ashkenazi and Sephardic populations share deep historical and religious connections, going back to a shared Middle Eastern origin thousands of years ago, the genetic evidence shows they experienced very different bottlenecks, different mixing events, and different migration histories over the centuries that followed. In other words, Jewish DNA isn't one single uniform genetic signature. It's a family of related but distinct population histories, each shaped by its own specific set of migrations, bottlenecks, and surrounding populations. This matters because it pushes back against the idea that any single ethnic or religious label automatically means one simple, uniform genetic story. Real population history is almost always more layered than a single label suggests. The Ashkenazi story is one thread. The Sephardic story is another, related but distinct thread. Both trace back, in part, to a shared ancient origin. But centuries of separate history gave each population its own unique genetic fingerprint, its own unique set of founder effects, and its own unique medical considerations that doctors and researchers have had to study separately. This is where a lot of people get uncomfortable in a different way than before, not because of disease risk this time, but because it complicates a simple, tidy story people might want to believe about their own identity. But complicated doesn't mean less meaningful. If anything, understanding the layers, the branches, and the separate paths different communities took makes the whole picture more interesting, not less. It shows history in motion, not history frozen into one simple, unchanging category. So where does that leave us after all of this? What does it actually mean, at the end of the day, to check a box on a medical form that says Ashkenazi Jewish? It means you're connecting yourself, whether you realized it or not, to a population that went through an extreme genetic bottleneck, likely down to just a few hundred people at its lowest point. It means you're connecting yourself to a long migration story stretching from the Middle East through southern Europe into the Rhineland, and eventually across Eastern Europe and out into nearly every corner of the world. It means you're connecting yourself to specific, identifiable health risks that researchers have studied closely and that doctors use right now, today, to offer better, more personalized care. And it means you're connecting yourself to one of the darkest chapters in recent human history, and to the fact that, despite everything, this population survived, rebuilt, and continues to grow today. Every migration, every marriage, every war, all of it happened on top of a genetic foundation laid down by a surprisingly small number of people centuries ago. And all of it is still, quietly, written into the DNA of roughly 10 million people alive on Earth right now. This isn't a closed case. Researchers are still working to pin down the exact size of the original founding population. They're still debating the precise timing of the earliest bottleneck and how it relates to later population crashes, including the Holocaust. They're still refining exactly how the Middle Eastern and Southern European genetic threads first came together, centuries before anyone called this population Ashkenazi at all. Every new study, using better sequencing technology and larger sample sizes, has the potential to shift the picture again, sometimes in small ways, sometimes in ways that overturn theories that seemed settled just a few years earlier. The story doesn't end here, because scientists are already asking the next set of questions. About earlier migrations, older bottlenecks, and genetic connections, researchers haven't fully mapped out yet, even after decades of careful study. And right now, nobody has the full answer.